I was assaulted and raped on
He
camera.
grabbed me from behind.
دومره درد داد چې ما د ښکاره شو زه به مړه شمه
আমার বয়স ছিল 15 এটা একটি দাওয়াতে ঘটেছিল
تا آخر عمرم باید با این خاطره دردناک زندگی کنم
Powiedział, że to była moja wina.
लड़के भी उतने उससे ज़्यादा जिम्मेदार है रेप के लिए ये लड़के हैं उससे ज़्यादा
Мне было около 11 лет, когда меня изнасиловали. Приблизно 10-15 солдатів гвалтували мене.
Eu queria me matar.
The violence expressed by a perpetrator in a single moment can alter another human being's life forever. This film gives you a glimpse into the imagined lives of 6 brutal rapists and examines the complicity of a society that breeds such individuals. No one becomes who they are in isolation.
Thank you to each of you for being here, and thank you to our incredible panel. Each of them is either a PhD at the least or a medical doctor, so everybody has a doctor before their name. Let me briefly introduce, or at least from my extreme right, I have Dr. Bess. I thought it would be more fashionable to say the first names, because Oprah is like Miss Winfrey is not half as good as Oprah, your first name basis. Dr. Darrin, Dr. Rohini, and Dr. Revathi. I'm Sheela Murthy, an immigration attorney, the only person without the doctor before my name. But I thought it would be interesting for us to get, and I can introduce each of them, but let me say that each of them has books, publications, is written about, but just briefly, both Dr. Bess and Dr. Darrin work at Montgomery College. Dr. Bess is an assistant administrative dean here. She's also an associate professor of sociology and previously helped to coordinate the Women's and Gender Studies program here at Montgomery College. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in liberal arts from Louisiana. She earned a Master of Arts in sociology and a Doctor of Philosophy from Tulane University in New Orleans. Her areas of specialization and research interests include crime and deviance, as well as women's and gender studies. She's published in peer-reviewed journals such as Deviant Behavior, Technology in Society and Environmental Science and Policy. In her current role, she's also part of Montgomery College's Title IX Advisory Board and plays a key role in helping to administer and interpret the college's climate survey on sexual assaults. Next, we have Dr. Darrin Campen, who is the college-wide Dean of Education and Social Sciences in Montgomery College. He holds advanced degrees in psychology and counselor education. Prior to working at Montgomery College, he served at Aiken Technical College as the Department Chair of History and Social Sciences and Coordinator of Psychology. Before working in academia, Dr. Campen worked as a psychologist in the North Carolina State Prison System. In addition to working at Montgomery College, he also works part-time for the University of Maryland University College, UMUC, where he regularly teaches psychology of human sexuality and psychology of gender. Next, we have Rohini, Dr. Rohini Anand, who is the Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo, responsible for the strategic direction, implementation, and alignment of Sodexo's integrated global diversity and inclusion initiatives, as well as Sodexo's corporate social responsibility and wellness strategies. Widely considered a leading expert on organizational change and diversity and inclusion, she has been featured in several articles and trade magazines, including the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Dr. Rohini has appeared on CNN, Bloomberg, CNN Money, as well as National Public Radio, NPR. She's been the recipient of several prestigious awards and honors. She chairs the Catalyst Board of Advisors and serves on the boards of organizations including the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, Community Wealth Partners, the National Organization on Disabilities, and Sodexo's Stop Hunger Foundation, and serves on the Charter Communications External Diversity and Inclusion Council. Next we have, and I don't have my because we just talked earlier this afternoon, actually right before this panel, about Dr. Revathi Vikram, who said, so what's my role? I know the Asha for Women said I should come here, and I said, well, we'll ask you questions from the audience, and she said, I can get on the stage. And I thought one of our speakers, Dr. Vicky, couldn't join us from Montgomery College, couldn't join us, so Dr. Revathi got the seat. And so if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Sheela, for just taking me on. We're all friends from Asha. I'm Revathi Vikram. I'm an MD. I'm a psychiatrist, board-certified psychiatrist. I've been living, well, let me go back. I did my university degree from Washington University in St. Louis. That was where I got my pre-med. And pre-Title IX days, I could not get into a medical school here. I went back to India and I went to Maulana Azad Medical College in New Delhi. And so I had the experience of what it's like to be a woman, a student, and as a doctor, how you deal with female patients as well during that time. I then worked in Egypt for a year and then England for a couple of years before I came to the US. Got board certified in psychiatry, worked in New York. My main interest was in cross-cultural psychiatry and women's issues. Fortunately, from 2002 to 2006, I actually got to live in Vienna, Austria, and I was the president of the United Nations Women's Guild, where we had a lot of issues around women's health from different countries, and a lot of sexual assault as well that we would talk in the context of UN employment as well. Since then, I've moved to Maryland and I've been active with Asha for Women. I'm on their board, so I work with domestic violence victims in this area. And Sheela and Rohini have been very, very helpful in pushing our agenda ahead. They're actually our benefactors. I'm also a commissioner for aging for Montgomery County, so I wear different hats, but this certainly is a pleasure to be here and be on this panel with this distinguished group. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Revathi. As you can see, we have truly a distinguished panel that can talk about the issues. But before we get into the technical, I thought it would make a lot of sense for us, for each of you to just share very briefly your reaction to the documentary. If you had any sense, because we could get the next question I was going to ask is why do we even have to be talking about this issue in 2017? But before that, and I'm sure everybody or anybody in the audience could probably speak about and we would love to hopefully have enough time to open it up for questions in a little bit. So, Dr. Rohini, would you like to?
Sure. I have to say that it was really disturbing, and it's very hard for me to be up here after watching that film. I actually, I had to step out for a minute because it really was extremely heavy. Having said that, I think Deepa Mehta has really tried to do something that is handle a very complex topic, do something that is extremely nuanced. The causes are not simple and they're extremely layered, and I think she's tried to put herself in the mindset of the perpetrators who themselves are victims of a cycle of violence. That's not to say that the perpetrators are not accountable. They certainly are, but they come with a history, they come with a context, and I think we all have to take responsibility for that context that we have created that allows and gives them permission to do what they have done. And then, of course, there's the layers in terms of patriarchal societies, the misogyny that exists in every culture, and the patriarchal societies that create gender roles and power differentials that get perpetrated through generations, and perpetrated not just by men, but by women as well. We saw in the movie, the mother basically kind of doting on the son, telling the daughter to give the food, give the sandals, and this sort of gets perpetuated. And I think the context, in the Indian context, the role of the mother-in-law really is one that perpetuates this patriarchal society and these gender roles, because all of a sudden now you have a mother-in-law who has never had the power. Now she has power over her daughter-in-law, and that cycle gets perpetuated. So I think it's disturbing, but I think she's attempted to do something that's very nuanced and layered, and it's not a simple topic.
Sure, and I think from what I understood, that this was actually some sort of they were shooting for like a workshop, I guess, and then part of the workshop, she just let each of them figure out and put themselves in the shoes of the perpetrators. And so it was each person, I guess, with their particular lens of how to approach or deal with this situation. Let's get, if some of any of you want to speak about or during your comments, you're welcome. But Dr. Bess, if I could ask you as a sociologist, so what are the sociological theories or factors that contribute to violence and or rape?
Watching a film like this, I think it makes us all uncomfortable, and it's certainly based on the content matter, but it's also because, especially here in America, we're very much focused on explaining choice in terms of an individual. And a lot of what the filmmaker is doing here is exploring some of the social context that also informs that decision-making process. As a sociologist, as a criminologist, when we talk about crime and deviance, there's a variety of theories that come into play. And none of them are precise and available to explain all crime, right? So we draw on this toolbox of theories. One would be trait theories. So we have biosocial theories rooted in a lot of psychological theories of cognitive disorders, things like that. All of those, from a sociological perspective, also have to be understood in the context of environment. There are rational choice theories, which are very much rooted in an individual's decision-making process. So we weigh the costs and the benefits of our actions, the likelihood of getting caught, the severity if we are caught. And those theories we draw on a lot because they seem to make sense to most people, right? I should weigh these things. But the reality is when we deal with a lot of crime, that would involve a level of premeditation and a level of rational thought that a lot of times are not present, especially if emotions are involved. There are social structure theories. So there's a whole school of thought really looking at social class and how social class informs crime and deviant behavior, whether that be looking at neighborhoods. Many of the men in this film, the perpetrators here, lived in slum-like settings, right? So how might that have influenced their behaviors, their subcultural theories that come into play, and also strain theories, right? When we're frustrated, we often look to alleviate that frustration. Sometimes that comes out in positive ways, like going to the gym for hours. Sometimes it comes out in negative ways. So we have social structure theories. We also see the presence of a lot of social learning theories here. So thinking about how environments, peer groups, family, religious beliefs, school, and education, and how those things, how we learn sometimes deviance or conformity, right? All of those really play a role in this film. As an educator, I look at a documentary, or not a documentary, a film like this, and I see the utility in a classroom setting, because you see the ability to apply all of these theories in a case like this.
Thank you. It's really scary and troubling to some extent when you say it's deviant behavior and people don't really analyze and choose it, and there's so many factors, because I guess all of us want to find a solution. You want to put it into a neat little box, tie it up with a string and say, there, I've solved it, QED. But obviously it's way, way more complicated and layered than that. So thank you for sharing a tip of the iceberg. And sort of continuing on, Dr. Darrin, so we talked a little bit about the sociological theories with Dr. Bess. What about the psychological factors that appear to contribute to sexual violence in society?
Right, and there are there's a lot of overlap between sociology and psychology when it comes to this case. I would say that the psychological factors that we see here are objectification of women and patriarchal belief system, the ability to dehumanize another person that came through clearly in this film, an exaggerated sense of masculinity. You can see that frequently, especially if the guy was the bodybuilder type, and an overall lack of empathy, which is very common among people with what we call antisocial personality disorder. I felt like I was back working in the prison for a moment, at the end particularly, with the guy, and very frequently blaming the victim. She shouldn't have dressed that way. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's just the way life goes. It's a cruel world, and that's just the way it is. So I saw some elements there in the people's psychology and belief systems that is very common among people that commit crimes of that nature.
Yeah, thank you. I think that last gentleman was the real, because all the others were the actors, except that was part of, I thought, does anybody know if that last person that was being interviewed was the real perpetrator, the rapist? Nobody's sure? All of them?
I think he was an actor, but...
the very last one wasn't part of that whole, I thought he was...
But they had interviewed
him in the beginning.
I think he acted so well. He played the part so well. It did feel like he did.
He really did. I thought he was brilliant. But when you talked about empathy, what surprised me, and maybe that was... Maybe the whoever, I guess, they showed somebody feeding the birds in the beginning, and I thought, well, I'm not sure, but could you sort of psychologically tell us because to me that showed care and concern for a living fellow creature, right. But again, I'm not sort of focused my life.
So that's part of the contradiction sometimes. Criminals are not criminal all the time, so they do kind things from time to time for people. Especially if it will benefit them in some way. So there could be some benefit to having the birds around. But you saw at the end, after they committed the crime, most of them were acting like
business as usual.
Nothing had happened. I'm just making an omelet and hey, go to work. Another day in the park, so to speak. And that's the disturbing part, I think, for a lot of people to see that.
Yeah, it sure is.
Sheela, if I can just add to that, I think, just the way they normalize the whole situation, right? Because I think that's their norm. I mean, that's the environment where it has been normalized. So which is why he kept saying again and again, this happens all the time. It's just that we got caught. This is what their experiences have been. So I think it's just this whole, this cycle that the perpetrators have kind of also been victims, again, not to give them a pass, but certainly that comes with the context.
I agree with all of you, the complexity of the human mind and the interplay between society and the human mind. Here, that example of feeding the birds, at the same time, there's another one of them who was praying every day before he went to do acts of thievery or damage and hitting somebody, stealing money, and all these other activities they were engaged in. The missing link was always the trauma that they went through. Each one of them had been traumatized as a child in one way or another, directly observing, as in domestic violence, the parents or sexually violated right from the beginning. They were all victims of that no one had ever addressed with them. And so parts of them are willing to be socially acceptable in the kindness or little acts of kindness, whereas the internalized self is this very negative, suppressed violence that comes out in bursts.
Thank you. And Dr. Rohini, I know we talk about the company you work with having over 425,000 employees worldwide in 80 countries. So it's clear, we talk about deviant sexual behavior being not associated with a particular country or race or even necessarily financial, social status. It's just it's deviant behavior. So, but how do you then, as Chief Global Diversity Officer, deal and address with some of these issues in a practical day-to-day? And I guess same with Darrin. You worked in a prison system, so you had to sort of find ways of how to try to deal and cope with those issues. So let me have Rohini start and then come to you, Darrin.
It's a little hard to make a transition to the corporate environment.
It is.
But I'm going to try, because you're right. I mean, I think this, this kind of behavior cuts across all socioeconomic classes because it is rooted in patriarchal societies that exist in every part of the world. Gender roles, power dynamics, these are the things that really account for a lot of the kinds of behaviors. So it spills into the workplace for sure. And to me, in terms of your question, Sheela, what I would say is that, these solutions to these kinds of issues really need partnerships across societies in general. So really need corporations working with public institutions and governments to come up with solutions, because at the end of the day, we employ people, and 430,000 employees means that there are several people who are both survivors of violence as well as perpetrators. And there's a cost to companies. You're talking about absenteeism, you're talking about turnover. All these things cost billions of dollars to companies. So I think it's incumbent on us, and I think there are. But I will say that this is a taboo topic in most organizations. Most organizations do not talk about violence against women. They think that's something that's private, it's personal, it's not to be discussed at work. I think that has got to change.
Well, at least it's now sexual harassment in the workplace is greatly, deeply frowned upon, whereas 50 years ago and in many countries in the world, the boss often can transgress upon the employees, and it's accepted part of the cultural norm, and it's part of the social.
And you're right about that, but when you think about it, when I was thinking about this, I thought, there are sort of generational issues here as well. So, as women get educated, get economically independent, I think their sort of roles change, they assert themselves, and there are generational gaps. But then when you think about, and I won't name companies, but when you think about companies where there are...
We all see them in the news every day. So.
Where there are young individuals, young men working in organizations who are, coming out of colleges, but are still sort of, perpetrators of the same kind of behavior.
Sure,
so
and Darrin,
harassment doesn't, it doesn't end.
I agree with you 100%. It's the culture, it's what's acceptable, it's what's normal, it's how they're brought up. We went into the cycle. So Darrin, I'll have you try to touch upon the answer to that question, and then Revathi wants to say something. So Darrin.
So in terms of the prison population, and what we used to do, we would try to teach people anger management skills. That was another variable. There was another place I worked before. It's a residential treatment facility for sex offenders, and they had all perpetrated acts on younger people. And when you looked at their history, they also had been attacked when they were children. So that cycle of violence, we would try to work with them on breaking that cycle of violence. One of the common things they find with people who engage in these sort of acts, deviant sexual behaviors, is that they're socially awkward and they don't know how to interact with the opposite sex. So we would try to train, especially if they were younger, we would try to work on them. How do you get a date, and how do you handle rejection and things of that nature. So sure, the inmates, of course, they had their own way of dealing with people who violated these sort of norms, and it was awfully violent at times. That was a whole different element and a whole different way of solving the problem.
When we talk of anger management, though, to me it seems obviously it's a great skill, and it's something that obviously we need to have people learn to react. But again, that seems more almost superficial rather than inside, deep inside, come back to what we talked about, the psychological, sociological, emotional, sort of cultural, religious, all of those deep inside of your soul, from inside out rather than from outside in. But that probably is a way longer and deeper process. And maybe as a psychiatrist, I don't know if that's...
We would try to work with people on that level, but frequently in prison, they're very hard. They are hardened and opening up about things that happened in the past is a challenge, especially they're super macho and they don't want to talk about it. But you could get some, and maybe you've had some experience with that.
The hardcore is very hard to break through that, not to get to the vulnerability of the person. And once you can get to that vulnerability, you can work out from there. But that's something they protect.
Right.
So, I mean, more than anything else in their life, they protect us.
Yeah, did some of the audience, let's make it more interactive. Let somebody from the, go ahead.
I want to draw attention to the last frame that we saw on the screen. It said that whatever happened, they caught the culprits, somebody was hanged, somebody committed suicide, and at the end it said that during the 2-year period that followed, the rape incident doubled. I don't know whether they are talking about Delhi or India.
No, they did not say the rape incidents doubled. They said the number of reported cases doubled because it gave apparently women a lot more freedom and courage to speak out because they felt society was on their side.
There is other side to it as well, that we brought those perpetrators to justice. At the same time, that did not act as a deterrent into the society.
That's the point, that despite what she's saying is correct, that you saw that people came out and this kind of issue came up and they were put to justice, but that made so much of noise in India and worldwide that should have at least threatened those kind of perpetrators that, you know what, we can't do this because the result is going to be deadly. But if it increased, we should not be clapping our hands that the cases were reported more. We should be wondering why did it still happen.
Yes.
Well, it goes back to this idea of punishment, right? That can't be our only solution in dealing with an issue like this, right? Oftentimes we think, well, the criminal justice system will respond. Well, the criminal justice system is sort of the cleanup crew, right? To think that people will think rationally, if I get caught, I will be hanged for this, is sometimes foolish. It's a common sense policy that isn't necessarily a deterrent. The severity of punishments rarely deter people from committing crime. If it did, capital punishment would be an effective policy.
Do you also think that it also inflicts the male machoism that, you know what, I can still do it and still not get caught because the way the last statement said it happened, so I was the unlucky guy who got caught.
And it's a known fact that rapes and sexual assault against women is greatly underreported. Forget in a country like India where there's a stigma and social, even in America, it's so underreported. It is beyond comprehension that people think they can get away with it. Does anybody want to comment about that, either Darrin or Bess?
So, two things. One is I think what we're seeing in that last frame is something that we all do. We all attempt to neutralize our behaviors. No one wants to, I mean, if he says, yes, I'm a rapist, what does it mean about his sense of self? It's the same thing we all do when we engage in deviant behavior. If you get pulled over by a police officer for speeding, chances are you have an excuse or justification that can explain that behavior. And I think part of what we're seeing is him trying to neutralize that behavior. And what we have to think about is a way to deal with rape that isn't based on people complying because they don't want to get caught, right? We have to, people have to recognize that this is problematic behavior that they don't want to do, right? It's an issue of self-control versus social control.
Yeah, we have to give one of the mics to the audience because they're recording it for the video, and so we need everything recorded clearly if they're going to play this as a documentary in Montgomery College and as a teaching tool. So with that, only those with the mic will be able to speak, but we'll pass the mic around. There are about half a dozen people at the back who've requested, and you'll be after that.
Well, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to voice my thoughts. This was definitely a thought-provoking film, and a lot of you did. And I felt that it was somewhat of a sympathetic portrayal of the perpetrators rather than the victim itself. And maybe in one film you can only tell one side of a story and not all aspects. And we all agreed that they were victims of their circumstances, but I still feel that at the end of it, I just kind of felt, something is missing here because it almost excuses the behavior in some ways. And when they were victims, they clearly recognized that it was wrong and they were hurt and they were angry. And I think as adults, you know what is right and wrong. So I think these were very conscious choices they made. And I think for us to just come out and say that they were victims of the circumstances is kind of giving them a huge, huge pass.
I think your reaction is very common, by the way, from what I understand from the movie, and that is one of the complaints that Deepa Mehta has, because she had these people role play to go and sort of understand and analyze how somebody could behave in such a cruel, inhuman, and outrageous manner. And I think people try to put themselves in the shoes of each of those 6 individuals, and so I think your abhorrence and frustration and anger is completely rational, reasonable and justified. And like you said, I think she was trying to just, because the whole country was on the other side, I think they were just trying to look at it from this side just to give it a slightly different perspective. She was trying to maybe weigh the scales, but we get your point. Does anybody on the panel want to address the concern of...
I would just say that the goal of psychology, or some of the goals of psychology, are to explain behavior and to predict behavior. So I saw a lot of those themes coming through in this film. Try to understand what are the factors that contribute. It's not an excuse. It's more of an understanding of trying to reach. There's no single common factor that you will find in all these cases for a rapist, but there are some themes that people do see.
I would like to add that, system changes need to occur. Individual passion was there, an individual at the time of the incident, or even in this movie, to try to parse out whose role was what and where it was. And I agree with you that, yes, I also felt that there was a lot of sympathy shown. But in what you said is, yes, we need to see both sides. Why would people behave in that way? We don't have to excuse them for it, but why would they do that? What are they coming from? Therefore, some of the changes that need to occur are also systemic changes, the patriarchal, how we raise our boys, how we value girls in this society, what kind of value do we place in respect for the other person's body and mind and soul. And these are issues that take a long time, and it has to start now.
What was interesting to that point is at the end, some of the politicians and the defense attorneys actually saying, it was a girl's fault, she shouldn't dress so scantily. I would lock my daughter up if she was out, or burn her, if she was out after 8 at night. I mean, this is all, emblematic of a very patriarchal society where the power imbalance is just so extreme. And for women who are trying to break out of that, it's not easy. So I think that's part of the whole system. But I would agree with you. I mean, I really struggled with it as well. But, I can see why Deepa Mehta was trying to do what she was doing in terms of presenting it in a very nuanced way.
You can only show that much in one film.
Right, and if you don't understand how the other side thinks, you will never be able to find a cure or a solution. Otherwise, each time it's blaming them. But if you understand, hopefully we can go to the root causes of the problem and try to eliminate it. I think there's a lot of that. I don't know how much, but I'm sure Deepa Mehta is such a brilliant movie maker and sort of trying to do it. She did it in a very different way, very, very differently approached than any other sort of movie that you would look at because there's at no point is the rape actually shown. It's sort of subtly inferred from all of the different images and the different interviews you have. Dr. Darrin, I know you worked in a violent security prison, right, with a lot of very violent people, and yes. There were a lot of similarities in the sense many of them were found guilty of rape. What do you think are the similarities between what you have seen in your work and what you saw or have seen and can gather from this film?
Yeah, we've already talked about a number of them, but I'll highlight them again. The antisocial personality traits, this is what they used to call a sociopath, people who have no remorse for others, blaming the victim. Another thing that I would highlight is that alcohol is, among the inmates that I worked with, alcohol was frequently involved when they committed their crime. And you see that also playing out here, because alcohol decreases inhibitions, impairs judgment. So that's frequently used among people who commit crimes. The other thing that I would highlight is that the people that I did work with in prison, they almost all came from abusive or neglectful homes. That was a very common finding, and worked in jobs to struggle and survive, much like the characters in the film. They were barely getting by or struggling to make ends meet. So that's a very frequent finding.
I thought it was interesting where you had the 3 A's. You said antisocial behavior, alcohol, and abusive homes. It just jumped out at me as the 3 A's.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
That's the way we Oh, somebody from the audience?
While Diva Mehta has tracked the trajectory of events concerning the lives of the 5 criminals, and in doing so, she has opened up the debate on nature versus nurture and also environmental conditioning. It somehow also troubles me that it does criminalize poverty and the socio-economic upbringing and status of the 5 adults who are responsible for the Highness Act. I also believe, well, I'm an educator myself, I'm a professor of English literature, and one of my students did a capstone class report, a 50-page report on how pedophilia is in some ways implanted, or the structure of the brain is responsible for the biochemistry, and there are people who have understood the brain who kind of would corroborate the evidence that these forms of aberrance, social aberrance, are located within the structure of the brain. So the second observation I wish to make is, rather than holding such academic kind of discussions, rather than discussing these in a very academic context, certain deans of colleges who may perhaps be motivated enough to think about offering classes, whether at the Montgomery County level, that is, or at the high school level, why not offer classes or courses on responsible behavior? There's such a huge upsurge of unreported domestic violence within the United States itself. Why not offer courses on domestic violence, on rape and sexual violence? I think that may perhaps resolve. The idea is to resolve rather than endlessly debate who and what is responsible.
As a small plug for Asha for Women, that's one of the tripod that we do with client services directly. But one of the things that I'm very involved in is going to colleges and universities. Usually we would like to be invited there, and that's often the South Asian college students or somebody. And we talk about things that are not talked in the home. Sexuality is never talked in the home. So that we talk to them about date rape. We talk to them about alcohol and drugs that are used. As soon as they come into the college, they're freshmen in college, they have no experience. They've come into this environment where they're not been trained. They taught academics, but they come to the school, the parents would pack up all the books and everything for them, but there's no discussion of these things. And I have made it one of my missions that I will go and open up that discussion, and I've done it at Georgetown, George Washington University, and a couple of other places, and well received, welcomed, and it's in a group setting with other students.
And this is such a hot topic, we could go on. I actually wanted to, in part of my questions was, how can we translate today's discussion on the road and truly make an impactful difference? For example, I was going to ask Bess, I think, about in the college level and these kinds of discussions, how can these discussions, how can this sort of analyzing, breaking up, discussing this sort of deviant behavior, how does it impact college students? How can we try to change the trajectory of violence going forward? And similarly for Rohini, about how can we impact it in the corporate culture and workplace?
I believe it was 2014, we saw some changes with the Title IX reporting, where we've seen greater mandates for education and prevention programming on college campuses related to sexual assault and violence. So we are seeing schools really respond to that. And the questions have been, where do they fit into the larger scope of colleges? Is this going into student life? Is it in academic affairs? And where does it insert into the conversation? So we are seeing a lot more programming now. We see a lot more primary prevention programming coming out. Alcohol EDU is something that our college also has rolled out to address some of these these pieces that you're talking about. We also have seen a growth in bystander intervention training, because the other piece of this that we don't, I mean, there are opportunities to explore it through this film, is what about the people who saw things happening and didn't do anything about it, right? And part of it is about recognizing the problem and feeling comfortable doing something, and it doesn't always have to be confrontational, but what are the tools in our toolbox, right? We all have moments where we're haunted by things, moments where we did not intervene, but training students on how to recognize problematic behavior, and that goes down to very basic definitions of sexual harassment and other forms of sexual violence. We're usually pretty well trained to identify the things that are most severe, but they happen with far fewer frequency than the lesser type things, you know.
Sensitize young minds.
Right, and so that is something that we're seeing, but these things are very new in the educational realm. So we have to find the support for that to keep and sustain the growth of those programs.
Okay, so we'll have Rohini answer later, but if you want to go ahead, because I know it's almost 4:28 and 4:30 is the closing ceremony, so I realize we're sort of being pressed for time.
No, I also wanted to just reinforce what she was saying, like, how do we do this? How do we change things as society? And as, you know, academics and professionals, you all go really deep, you know, with the problems of people in the prisons and different places. You know, what we could do in our very homes and our places of worship is to say that, you know, values dictate behavior. Values predict behavior. So when we teach people that values are important, whether if it's for the teenagers' use of the phones or the way they treat one another, you know, if we instill this again, I think that will create an impact in the long run, so that we don't have to fix things as much as, you know, we have to teach things.
So I completely agree with you. I think each one of us has a role to play in this, and I think that changing those power dynamics, changing gender roles, how we bring up daughters and sons is absolutely critical. I think also educating women, particularly in India, so that they can be economically independent and break out of this power dynamics. I think, you know, including men in the solution. So I think men need to be part of it, because at the end of the day, the power is held by men. This is not a zero-sum game the way men see it. So I think it's important to include men in the solutions as well as women, because as mothers, you know, we do condition sons and daughters differently sometimes. And then I think the more systemic issues, as you mentioned, you know, the poverty, the cycle of violence, the cycle of abuse, I think that's a far bigger issue. But I think it is very nuanced, very layered, and I think all of us can play a role in breaking that.
And I think each of us, I'm sure, especially those who grew up in India, can share lots of stories. As a child growing up in Delhi, we were three girls. Both my other sisters are medical doctors. I was the black sheep, law school, lawyer, all of that. And constantly people would say, well, why don't you have a son? Why don't you keep trying? And they'd be like, no, I think 3 is plenty. That's a lot of work. And they'd be like, no. And I would see some neighbors and friends give their sons more food to eat. I was aghast because I had never seen that, maybe because we were only 3 girls and I thought it was sort of different culturally. It was like shocking that they would give all the good food, the cream, the butter, the yummy stuff to the boys and tell the girls, well, you're going to be somebody else's property, so you don't deserve this food. And it would just make my blood boil as a child to hear things like that, which is why I'm actively in sort of all this feminist stuff bubbling inside of me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much. Actually, I was just thinking sometimes the girls are ashamed or embarrassed after the event occurs, whether it's here or in India or any other developing country. So sometimes girls need to have a lot of sense of respecting their own self. Another thing is they have sometimes family members abuse girls, whether here or abroad. It's like an uncle or brother, cousin. So sometimes they will not open up, they're ashamed. Quite a lot of people I've met here or other places, maybe 20 years after they'll admit, and they'll be so sad. So I think sometimes, like when the kids are small, whether they're boys or girls, they should be given respect about themselves and to respect others. It goes with the ladies, especially like, you know, all girls and their mothers or the boys. In a high school, parents should be educated and told to be more respectful, teach the kids to be more respectful to the girls or to the boys, you know, because that would help Because if guys are, when my son went to high school, my friends who had girls, they told me, please tell your son to be very respectful of every girl he meets. And that was lovely. I think I like that sort of advice.
Well, it's easier also when you transport it to another culture and there's a much greater sensitivity. And here the word no means no. In a culture and country like India, sometimes it doesn't automatically. It always, oh, she's saying no because she's shy. Oh, she's saying no, but she really doesn't mean the no. Whereas here it's like, well, I want to go to jail. Even here, we hear how rampant it is, prevalent it is. So, yeah, I'll tell you what, it's 4:30. I know, Manoj, the final movie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, we'll take one last question from the audience, but I'm going to have Revathi maybe respond briefly. One last question, and let's try to wrap up. It's a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could go on all night, because this is really something that we want to learn, and it's something that's extremely passionate.
Question or comment. At the end of the day, everybody's looking for some sort of validation. Every human being, whether guy or a girl and coming back to it in the society and social fabric, if we can figure out and create situations where every human being is recognized and appreciated in the school and colleges level, even a Rotaract club. Since we're all Rotarians and we interact clubs, we start in the schools just so that the kids have voice. And I know Rotarians who work with high school kids who would be going and doing all of these things, but just because they're able to be recognized and appreciated by one human being in their life, it may not be their parent, it may not be anybody close to them, but somebody who actually valued them as a human being totally puts them on a different trajectory. And those are some of the things in social fabric that we need to do more and more of to be able to see. Like one guy I listen to a lot, Simon Sinek, he talks about it's sometimes not people. It could be the same person in one environment behaving absolutely differently than the other way. I don't think it's anybody's life goal to go out and rape as many women as he can, or anybody's life goal to be raped or to go out and do the things that are not really appreciated in society. But sometimes the things, it's a matter of getting to what is causing that behavior, as opposed to just treating the symptoms.
Right, and that's exactly what we were talking about earlier in the discussion as well. And, the truth is, even whatever the psychological factors you have, we talked about nurture versus nature, and you have different siblings growing up with the exact same parents and going to the same school in the same socio-economic environment, but one sibling becomes a career criminal and the other one, maybe get a Nobel Prize. So you have extremes. So it's not just society, it's who you are, what you are, it's society, it's a combination, it's your own internal compass, a whole set of factors that play into the equation. And clearly, I should be speaking the least, considering I'm the only one without the doctor before my name. I'm going to invite, because I know it's 4:35 and the last program started at 4:30. So what I'm going to do is see if any of the speakers, the panelists, esteemed panelists, wanted to end on any thought or comment.
I just wanted to address her remarks about patriarchal societies, and particularly our culture in South Asia. I have seen more South Asian young women coming as patients with depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders, personality disorders, goes back to having been sexually violated by a family member as a child. So yes, it's rampant and its ramifications are lifelong. So yes, the education and nurturance of children has to be very different.
And it's here too.
And you know what? Absolutely.
In India, it's multiple victims and multiple perpetrators. That's kind of different.
And even though we had planned to end the session, when Manoj Singh picks the phone as the founder, the starter of the DC South Asian Film Festival, His Royal Highness is allowed to speak.
Please don't say all of that. This is a very, very serious discussion. The only thing I would contribute to it, and experts are on the panel to analyze, and this will be a continuous process because we're humans and it's complex. But on the flip side, I just want to say first, the rapists were poor. If they were rich and the girl did not die, you touched upon,
they might have
the
gone
whole
to be Scott
equation was different. So, number one. Number two, there are improvements happening in India. The young judges, the young generation which is coming, are making very hard choices and doing the right thing. First of all, the police is being retrained. In Kerala and all, they're approaching the same way US police does when the female victims come in. The whole FIR report process is changing. If you remember that if there was an incident on the road, people would just run away because they were scared that why should I get involved? I'll be called by the police, harassed, called to the courtroom. Right. Now there is no FIR report. First take the victim to the hospital, but no questions asked. So a lot of things are changing, but this will be a continuous process. So on the, like I said, the younger judges are making hard. If you read papers lately, a lot of gurus are being put in jail. And a lot of there's a female police stations being established everywhere for female victims to come. There are more laws becoming more for women. Even in dowry or marriage or anything, but hats off to all of you, first of all, accepting the invitation, and this is a very complex, this will continue, and we should have these kind of discussions, very important.
Thank you, Manoj, for telling me to thank. Let's give a big round of applause to the panelists. Thank you, Bess, Darrin, Rohini, and Revathi. And let's give a big round of applause to Manoj for the DC Film Festival to run something like this, and to our volunteers who do such a great job.
Thank you for moderating the session.
It's an honor. Thank you very much.